They told her it was worthless land, until her dog refused to leave what was buried beneath it. The door shut behind her on Cedar Street, quiet but final. Margaret didn't argue. She stepped down with a suitcase, her German shepherd still staring at the house like something hadn't ended yet. Days later, standing in a patch of wild, forgotten land they said wasn't worth keeping, he stopped, and this time, he wouldn't move. Would you have trusted your dog enough to keep digging, even when everything said to walk away? The door clicked shut behind her, with a sound that was too soft for what it meant. Margaret Hale stood there for a second longer than she needed to, one hand still resting on the worn brass knob, as if it might turn back on its own if she waited. It didn't. Inside, voices moved quickly. Her daughter-in-law's voice, light and practical, already talking about paint colors. Flooring. "We can open this wall," she said, somewhere beyond the hallway. Her son answered, but his words were lower, harder to catch. He didn't come back to the door. Margaret let her hand fall. The late morning sun on Cedar Street was bright but thin, the kind of light that didn't warm anything. It made the edges of things look sharper than they felt. The maple tree by the sidewalk cast a broken shadow across the yard she had mowed for 27 years. The grass had gone patchy this summer. She had meant to fix it. She turned and stepped down onto the walkway. Her suitcase waited at the bottom of the steps. Blue, hard shell, one wheel that didn't roll straight anymore. Next to it, 2 plastic storage bins with snap-on lids, one filled with folded clothes, the other with things that didn't fit anywhere else. A framed photo wrapped in a dish towel, a stack of books, a small box of kitchen utensils she had picked through without really thinking. Rex sat beside them. He didn't move when she came closer, just sat there, straight-backed, eyes fixed on the front of the house. Not the door exactly, higher than that. The second-floor window, the one at the end of the hall. "Come on," she said quietly. He didn't respond. Margaret followed his gaze. The curtains in that window were half open. She could see the corner of the dresser, the edge of a mirror. Nothing moving. Nothing looking back. For a moment, it felt like she had stepped out of something mid-sentence, like there had been a word left unsaid somewhere inside those walls, and now it would stay there, hanging. She picked up the handle of the suitcase. It dragged slightly when she pulled it toward the curb, the uneven wheel catching on the cracks in the walkway. Rex stood then, finally, but he didn't come with her right away. He lingered at the edge of the yard, still watching. "Rex," she said again, softer this time. He turned his head, slow and deliberate, then trotted over and stopped at her side, close enough that his shoulder brushed her leg. A car passed on Cedar Street, slowing just a little as it went by. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough. Across the road, a curtain shifted in Mrs. Talbot's front window. Margaret saw it, then looked away. Someone else stepped out onto their porch 2 houses down, pretending to check the mail. The lid of the mailbox opened, closed, opened again. People noticed. They always did when something didn't fit. An older woman standing on the curb with her life in 2 plastic bins and a suitcase that didn't roll right. That didn't fit. Margaret didn't blame them. She might have looked too, once. She set the suitcase upright and rested her hand on the handle. For a second, she wasn't sure what to do next. The taxi she'd called was still a few minutes out. The street stretched both directions, quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. Behind her, the house stood exactly as it always had. Same siding, same narrow porch, same wind chime by the door that hadn't rung once since she stepped outside. Oh, only now it felt Closed. Not just locked. Finished. Rex shifted his weight. Margaret glanced down at him. His ears were forward, body still tense, eyes drawn back to the house again. There was something in the way he watched it. Not confusion, not anxiety. Attention. As if he were waiting for something. "It's done," she said, almost to herself. The words didn't land anywhere. She looked up one more time. Not at the door this time, but at the second-floor window, the one Rex had been staring at. She tried to remember what was still in that room, what she had left behind without thinking. There were too many things to count, so she stopped trying. A breeze moved through the street, carrying the faint smell of cut grass and warm pavement. It brushed against her arms, light but steady, like a reminder that time hadn't paused with her. She adjusted her grip on the suitcase. When the taxi finally turned onto Cedar Street, it slowed as it approached, the driver's owl flicking from her to the house and back again. He pulled up to the curb without saying anything, just stepped out and opened the trunk. "Need a hand?" he asked. Margaret nodded once. He lifted the bins first, then the suitcase, placing them carefully inside as if they might contain something fragile. Maybe they did. Rex circled once before hopping into the back seat, settling himself against the door, but keeping his head turned toward the house. Always watching. Margaret opened the passenger door and paused. Just for a second. Not because she expected anything to change, not because she thought someone might come running out, calling her name, but because something in her still needed to mark the moment. She looked at the house. Then she got in. The door closed with a firmer sound than the one behind her had made. As the taxi pulled away, the house slipped past the window in pieces. The porch, the steps, the patchy lawn, the second-floor window. Rex didn't take his eyes off it. Not until the street turned. Even then, his head stayed angled toward the rear window, as if the house might somehow come back into view if he held it there long enough. Margaret noticed. She didn't say anything. The taxi moved through familiar streets, past the corner store where she used to buy milk on Sundays, past the small park where the benches always stayed just a little damp in the mornings. Everything looked the same, too much the same. Like nothing had happened. The driver cleared his throat once like he might ask a question, then thought better of it. He kept his eyes on the road. Margaret rested her hands in her lap. They were still. That was the strange part. She expected them to shake, or at least feel something. Tightness, maybe. But they just lay there. Palms down. Quiet. Rex shifted once, then settled again, pressing his body against the door. Still alert. Still listening. They didn't go far. The lawyer's office sat in a narrow brick building downtown, wedged between a closed antique shop and a bakery that smelled faintly of sugar and coffee even from the street. The kind of place Margaret had walked past 100 times without noticing. Now it mattered. The driver parked along the curb and stepped out again, moving with the same careful politeness as before. He opened the trunk, handed her one bin at a time, then the suitcase. "You all set?" he asked. Margaret nodded. He hesitated for a moment, like he might say something else. Then he just gave a small, respectful nod and got back in the car. Rex jumped down beside her, landing softly, then immediately scanned the street. Not anxious, just aware. Margaret adjusted her grip on the suitcase and headed inside. The office was cooler than outside. The air carried that familiar scent. Paper, old carpet, something faintly metallic from filing cabinets that had been opened too many times. A receptionist sat behind a low desk, typing slowly, glasses resting at the end of her nose. "Mrs. Hale?" she asked, without looking up. Margaret nodded again. "Mr. Callahan is expecting you. Down the hall, second door on the left." The hallway felt longer than it was. Each step echoed just slightly, the sound of her shoes too loud against the quiet. Rex walked close beside her, his nails clicking softly on the floor. When she reached the door, it was already open. Her son was sitting inside. He stood quickly when he saw her, smoothing his shirt in the same motion. He looked composed, too composed, like he had already rehearsed this moment in his head. "Mom," he said. Margaret stepped in. The room was small. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out onto the side of another building. No view, just brick. Mr. Callahan sat behind the desk, a thin man with neatly parted hair and a voice that carried a practiced calm. "Mrs. Hale," he said, standing, "please have a seat." Margaret sat. Rex lowered himself beside her chair, but he didn't relax. His head stayed up, eyes moving between the men in the room. Papers were already laid out on the desk, neat stacks, tabs marking different sections. Mr. Callahan began speaking. He explained the will in a steady, measured tone. Dates, signatures, legal language that moved like a slow current, easy to follow, but impossible to stop. Margaret listened. The house on Cedar Street had been transferred. The savings accounts divided. Investments liquidated and reassigned. Each sentence landed with the same weight. Not heavy, not light. Just final. Her son spoke once, leaning forward slightly. "We went through everything already, Mom. It's all straightforward." Margaret turned her head just enough to look at him. He held her gaze for a second, then looked back at the papers. Mr. Callahan cleared his throat and moved to the last page. "There is one remaining asset," he said. Margaret waited. A half-acre parcel of land, located approximately 15 miles outside the city limits. It's currently undeveloped, overgrown, according to the last assessment. He slid a document across the desk. "That property has been left to you, Mrs. Hale." Silence settled in the room. Margaret looked down at the paper. The address didn't mean anything to her. Just a string of numbers and a road name she didn't recognize. Her son gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "Mom, it's really nothing," he said. "Just an old lot. We checked it out on the map. No utilities, no structure. It'd probably cost more to clear it than it's worth." Rex's ears shifted. Not forward, not back, just focused. Margaret didn't look at him, but she felt the change. "We figured," her son continued, "it's not something you'd want to deal with. Honestly, we can handle it later, sell it maybe, or just let it sit." Margaret traced the edge of the paper with her finger. The word undeveloped stood out. Empty. That's what they were saying. Empty. Mr. Callahan spoke again, gently. "Of course, the decision is entirely yours. You are the sole owner of that parcel now." Rex let out a low sound. Not a bark, not even a growl exactly. Something quieter. Deeper. Margaret's son paused mid-sentence. "Rex," Margaret said softly. The dog went still, but his eyes didn't leave the desk. Her son laughed once, short and uncertain. "Guess he doesn't like paperwork either." Margaret didn't respond. She picked up the pen. For a moment, it hovered above the page, not because she was unsure, but because she realized something strange. There was nothing left to hold on to. Not the house, not the accounts, not even the arguments that might have come with them. Just this. A piece of land no one wanted. She signed her name. The ink settled into the paper without hesitation. Mr. Callahan gathered the documents, nodding as if everything had gone exactly as expected. "That concludes the transfer," he said. Margaret stood. Her son stood too, stepping toward her. "Mom, we'll figure things out. You don't have to worry about that lot right now." Margaret met his eyes again. This time, she held them. "I'm not worried," she said. Her voice was steady. Not cold. Not warm. Just certain. Rex stood as well, aligning himself at her side. As they turned to leave, Margaret folded the paper once and slipped it into her bin. She didn't look at it again. Not yet. Outside, the air felt different. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just unfamiliar. Rex stepped ahead of her for the first time that day, pulling slightly on the leash, his attention fixed somewhere beyond the street. Margaret followed. She didn't ask where. The sidewalk gave way to a quieter stretch of town, where the buildings thinned out and the air carried less noise. The hum of traffic faded behind them, replaced by the soft rustle of trees and the distant clatter of something loose in the wind. Rex walked with purpose. Not fast, not frantic, just steady. Margaret adjusted her grip on the bin in her left hand and let him lead. The address folded inside her belongings felt heavier than it should have. She hadn't looked at it again since the office. Not yet. They reached the trailer park just past the edge of downtown, a narrow row of aging units lined up along a gravel lot. Faded paint. Small porches. Wind chimes that had seen better days. The woman at the front office didn't ask many questions, just pointed her to Unit 12 and handed her a key. Inside, the trailer smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older underneath, wood that had soaked up years of heat and cold and quiet living. It was small. One narrow couch, a kitchenette with a sink that dripped if you didn't turn it tight enough, a bed tucked behind a thin divider. Margaret set the bins down near the door. The suitcase followed with a dull thud. Rex walked the length of the space once, slowly, his nose low, his body still alert. He paused at the door, then turned his head toward the direction they had come from. Toward the city. Toward Cedar Street. Margaret watched him for a moment. Then she moved past him and opened one of the bins. Not because she needed anything, just to do something. A dish towel came out first, then a small framed photo, her and Daniel standing in front of a lake she couldn't quite place anymore. The glass had a faint crack in one corner. She set it on the counter. The sink dripped once, twice. She tightened the handle until it stopped. The silence settled again. That night came quietly. No traffic outside. No voices through the walls. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the trailer shifting as it cooled. Margaret lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. It wasn't restlessness. Not exactly. More like her mind didn't know where to land. Every time it started to settle, something pulled it back. An image. A sound. A moment that hadn't finished happening yet. The door closing. The second-floor window. The paper on the desk. Rex didn't lie down. He stood near the door, facing it, ears up, listening. "Rex," she said softly into the dark. He didn't move. After a while, he padded across the floor and lay down beside the bed. But even then, his head stayed up, eyes open, fixed on something she couldn't see. Morning came with a thin line of light through the window. Margaret sat up slowly, her back stiff, her hands resting on her knees for a second before she stood. The air smelled different here, less city, more open. She made coffee with the small machine on the counter. It sputtered before it worked, like it needed convincing. The smell filled the trailer quickly, stronger than it needed to be in such a small space. She carried the cup outside. The gravel lot stretched quiet in front of her. A few cars. A plastic chair tipped over near the next unit. Someone's radio playing softly through a window down the row. Rex stepped out beside her. He stood still for a moment, then turned his head. Not toward the other trailers, not toward the road, but toward something farther out. Margaret followed his gaze. Beyond the last row of trailers, the pavement ended. The road narrowed into a cracked strip of asphalt that bent out of sight behind a stand of trees. Past that, the land rose slightly, uneven and overgrown. She didn't need to check the paper to know. That was the direction. Rex took a step forward, then another. The leash tightened. Not yet, Margaret said, though she wasn't sure why. He stopped, but his body leaned into the direction, like something just out of reach was pulling him. Margaret went back inside and picked up the folded document. This time, she read it. The address was simple. A county road. No number. Just a marker near a bend, described in a way that assumed you already knew where to look. She folded it again, slower this time. By mid-morning, they were walking. The air had warmed just enough to carry the smell of damp soil. Not unpleasant, just heavy. The kind of smell that settled low and stayed there. The cracked road stretched ahead, its edges crumbling into patches of grass and weeds that had pushed through over time. Old fence posts leaned at angles, their wire long gone or tangled into the brush. Rex walked slightly ahead, his pace measured. Margaret kept up. The city fell away behind them with each step. The sounds changed. Fewer cars, more wind, a distant crow calling from somewhere she couldn't see. The road curved once, then again, and then it ended. Or rather, it stopped pretending to be a road. Ahead, the ground shifted into uneven dirt and scattered stones. Grass grew in thick patches, tall enough to brush against her legs as she stepped forward. "This is it," she said quietly. Not to Rex. To herself. The lot stretched wider than she expected. Not large in a way that impressed, just enough to feel uncontained, untouched. Weeds covered most of it. Thick, layered growth that had been left alone for too long. Rusted remnants of an old fence lay half-buried near the edges. A broken post leaned sideways, its base swallowed by the earth. There was no house, no shed, no sign that anything had ever been here. Just land, overgrown, unmaintained, forgotten. Margaret stepped further in, the grass parting around her legs with a dry whisper. The ground felt uneven beneath her feet, softer in some places, hard-packed in others. Rex moved past her. Not wandering, not sniffing randomly. He followed a loose path, if it could be called that, through the brush, his body moving with quiet certainty. Margaret watched him. That same feeling returned. Not fear, not exactly. Something quieter, like standing in a place where something had happened and hadn't quite left yet. Rex stopped near the center of the lot. He didn't bark. He didn't dig. He just stood there, looking down, then up, then back at her. waiting. Margaret felt it again, that strange resistance in the air, like something just beneath the surface was holding its breath. She took one more step forward and paused. The land was supposed to be empty. But standing there with Rex watching her like that, it didn't feel empty at all. Margaret didn't move right away. The wind passed through the tall grass in slow waves, brushing against her legs, whispering against itself. Somewhere behind her, a loose piece of metal tapped softly against a fence post. The sound came and went, uneven. Rex turned his head slightly, then stepped forward. Not far, just enough to draw her attention. The ground shifted under her feet as she followed, soft in places, packed down in others, the kind of unevenness that came from years of neglect. Or something else. "Rex," she said, low. He didn't look back this time. He moved deeper into the lot, pushing through a stretch of brush that was thicker than the rest. Thorned vines tangled together, climbing over themselves, forming a wall that didn't seem worth crossing. Margaret stopped at the edge. "This is enough," she said. Rex stopped too. But he didn't turn around. He stood there, facing the thicket, his body still, not tense, not aggressive, just fixed. Waiting. Margaret watched him for a moment. Then she stepped closer. The vines scratched lightly against her sleeves. One caught the fabric and pulled, slow and stubborn, until she eased it free. The smell here was stronger, green and damp, with a faint sourness underneath, like something had been left too long without air. Rex shifted again, stepping slightly to the side, making space. Margaret frowned. "You want me to go through that?" she asked, though she didn't expect an answer. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just stood there, looking at her now. That same look he had given her back at the trailer, back on Cedar Street. Like he was trying to show her something she hadn't seen yet. Margaret exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. She pushed one arm forward, testing the vines. They resisted at first, then gave a little, the dry branches snapping softly under pressure. Thorns caught her skin, sharp but not deep, enough to make her pause. She pushed again. This time she stepped in. The world narrowed immediately. The open lot disappeared behind her, replaced by a tight, tangled space where the light filtered through in broken patches. The air felt cooler here, still. Rex slipped through ahead of her with ease, his body weaving between the branches, like he knew exactly where to step. Margaret followed more slowly. Each step had to be chosen, each movement careful. The vines pulled at her clothes, her hands, her hair. Once she nearly lost her balance when her foot sank slightly into softer ground beneath the brush. "Easy," she murmured to herself. They moved like that for several minutes, or maybe less. Time didn't feel clear inside that space. Then Rex stopped, completely. Margaret came up behind him, brushing the last of the vines aside with her arm. She stepped forward, and the ground opened up just enough for her to stand without pushing through anything. A small clearing. Not large, just a patch where the vines had thinned, the ground more visible beneath. Margaret looked around. Nothing. Just dirt. Leaves. A few stones half buried in the soil. The same overgrowth pressed in from all sides, as if the space had been swallowed and forgotten. She let out a small breath. "This is what you brought me to?" she said. Rex didn't move. He lowered his head slightly. Not to sniff, not to dig. Just lowered it. Margaret's eyes followed the motion. At first, she didn't see anything. Then she noticed the difference. The ground here wasn't quite like the rest. The dirt looked flatter, more even, not naturally worn, but pressed, like something had once been placed there, or covered. She crouched slowly. Her knees protested, but she ignored it. One hand reached down, brushing away a thin layer of dry leaves. Underneath, the soil felt firmer. Packed. Her fingers moved again, clearing a little more. A faint outline began to form. Not clear, not obvious. But there. A shape that didn't belong to the randomness of the rest of the lot. Margaret sat back slightly, her breath quieter now. Rex stepped back, giving her space again. That was when she felt it. That same strange resistance in the air, but stronger now. Not threatening. Just present. Like something had been waiting longer than she had. Margaret wiped her hands against her pants and stood. "We'll need tools," she said softly. Rex didn't respond, but his body relaxed, just a fraction. As if that was enough for now. Margaret took one last look at the ground before turning back toward the vines. The path they had come through didn't look like a path anymore, just a break in the branches, already trying to close again. She pushed through slowly, the thorns catching her sleeves again, pulling at her as if the place didn't want to let her go so easily. When she stepped back into the open lot, the light felt harsher, brighter. The air moved again. She turned once more, looking at the wall of vines. From the outside, there was no sign of what lay just beyond it. No hint, no mark. Just overgrowth. Just a place no one would bother with. Margaret walked back toward the road in silence. Rex stayed close this time. No pulling, no leading. But every few steps, he glanced back, as if making sure she wouldn't forget where they had been. By the time they reached the edge of the lot, Margaret already knew. She would be coming back. Not because she wanted answers, not yet, but because something had been left there, something just beneath the surface. And for the first time since she had stepped onto Cedar Street with a suitcase and 2 bins, she felt like she hadn't been left with nothing after all. That feeling stayed with her through the night. Not strong, not comforting. Just there. Margaret lay awake in the narrow bed of the trailer, staring at the ceiling, where the faint glow from the street lamp outside barely reached. The heater clicked on and off in uneven cycles. Pipes shifted somewhere behind the walls. Rex didn't sleep. He lay near the door, head up, ears alert. Every so often he would lift his nose slightly, as if catching something on the air that Margaret couldn't. "Nothing's out there," she said quietly once. Rex didn't move. Morning came slow. Margaret made coffee in a chipped mug, the kind that held heat too long and tasted faintly of everything that had ever been poured into it. She stood by the small window, watching a thin fog settle low over the road. Her hands were already sore. She flexed her fingers, then reached for the pair of old gardening gloves she had brought from the house, one of the few things she hadn't left behind. Rex stood before she said a word. By the time she stepped outside, leash in hand, he was already waiting. The walk back to the lot felt shorter. Or maybe it was just different now. The place didn't look as empty. Not anymore. Margaret didn't hesitate at the edge this time. She stepped through the grass, past the leaning fence posts, straight toward the patch of blackberry vines. Rex moved ahead of her, but slower now, watching her, making sure she followed. When they reached the thicket, Margaret paused just long enough to pull the gloves on. The leather was stiff, cracked along the seams, but still strong enough to handle thorns. "Let's see what you found," she murmured. She pushed into the vines again. This time she knew where to step. Still careful, still slow, but less uncertain. The clearing revealed itself again, just as before. Quiet, hidden, waiting. Margaret set her small bag down and pulled out a pair of pruning shears. The metal clicked softly as she tested the grip. Then she began. The first cut was shallow, just a thin branch, dry and brittle. It snapped clean. The sound echoed strangely in the enclosed space. She paused, listened. Nothing. Only the faint rustle of leaves shifting somewhere above. She kept going. Cut by cut. Branch by branch. The vines resisted more than she expected. Some were thick, wound tight around each other, anchored deep into the ground. Others snapped easily, falling away in tangled loops that caught at her boots. The thorns were relentless. Even through the gloves, she could feel them pressing, finding the weak spots, slipping through when she wasn't careful. Once a sharp edge scraped across her wrist where the glove didn't quite reach. She hissed under her breath. Rex shifted closer, watching. "I'm fine," she said. He didn't relax. Margaret worked steadily. Time stretched. The clearing widened, slowly revealing more of the ground beneath. Leaves gave way to packed dirt. Dirt gave way to something flatter, more defined. Her breathing grew heavier, but she didn't stop. Something in her wouldn't let her. Not after yesterday. Not after seeing that outline. The shears clipped through another thick branch, then another. And then a dull, hollow sound. Different from the rest. Margaret froze. She looked down. The shears rested against something metal. Not a pipe. Not a random piece of debris. Flat. Wide. She knelt slowly, brushing away the loose dirt and remaining leaves with both hands. The surface came into view. Rusted, but intact. A rectangular plate, set into the ground, with edges just barely visible beneath years of growth. A hatch. Margaret stared at it. For a long moment, she didn't move. Rex stepped back. Not far. Just enough. Like he had the day before, giving her space. "All right," she whispered. Her voice sounded smaller now. She ran her hand along the edge of the metal, feeling for a handle. The surface was cold despite the morning sun, rough under her fingertips. Then she found it. A recessed grip, half filled with dirt. She cleared it out slowly, careful not to rush. Her heart was beating harder now, not from the work, from something else. Margaret positioned her hands. Paused. The air felt still, heavier than it should have. She pulled. At first, nothing happened. The hatch resisted, sealed by time and pressure. She adjusted her grip and pulled again, harder this time. A low creak broke through the silence, metal scraping against metal. The sound traveled deeper than it should have. The hatch shifted, just slightly. Rex's ears flicked forward. Margaret pulled again. The resistance gave, slowly, reluctantly. The hatch lifted. A breath of air rose from below. Cool. Still. Carrying a scent she couldn't place at first. Not decay, not mold, something older, closed, like a space that had been sealed carefully, not abandoned. Margaret stepped back instinctively, letting the hatch rest open. The darkness below didn't reveal anything right away, just a narrow opening, a suggestion of depth. Rex didn't move toward it. He stayed where he was, watching, waiting. Margaret leaned closer, careful, listening. Nothing came from below. No sound, no movement, just that same quiet, steady air rising upward. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small flashlight. The beam flickered once before holding steady. She aimed it downward. Wooden steps, narrow, leading into something she couldn't fully see yet. Margaret swallowed. Her hand tightened slightly around the flashlight. Behind her, the wind moved faintly through the outer lot, brushing against the tall grass again. But inside the clearing, nothing moved, nothing shifted. It felt separate, contained. Margaret looked at Rex. He met her eyes. Calm. Certain. As if this part, this moment, was exactly where he had been leading her all along. She turned back to the opening. And for the first time, she understood. This land had never been empty. It had been waiting. Margaret stayed at the edge of the opening for a long time. Long enough for the light to shift above her. Long enough for the sounds of the road to fade into something distant and unimportant. She held the flashlight steady, its beam cutting down into the narrow space below. The wooden steps looked solid. Not new, but not broken either. Worn in a way that suggested use, not neglect. Someone had built this carefully. Not in a hurry. Not as a temporary fix. Rex moved closer, stopping just behind her shoulder. He didn't push forward. He didn't retreat. He simply stayed. Margaret exhaled slowly. Well, she murmured, more to herself than to him. We didn't come this far to stand at the top. She placed one foot onto the first step. It held. The wood creaked softly under her weight, but it didn't shift. She tested the next step, then the next. Each one steady, each one leading her further down. The air changed as she descended. Cooler. Still. Carrying that same faint scent. Dry wood, metal, something faintly familiar she couldn't quite name yet. Halfway down, she paused and looked back. The opening above framed a small patch of sky, bright and distant now. Rex stood there, watching her. Come on, she said quietly. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he followed. Careful, controlled, each step deliberate. When Margaret reached the bottom, she stepped onto a solid floor. Not dirt, not concrete. Wood, smooth in places, scuffed in others. She lifted the flashlight, sweeping it slowly across the space. And then she stopped, because it wasn't a storage pit. It wasn't a crawl space. It wasn't anything she had expected. It was a room. No, more than a room. A house. Not large, not elaborate, but complete. The beam of light revealed walls made of fitted panels, reinforced and sealed. A narrow hallway stretched to one side. Shelves lined one wall, neatly arranged with tools, containers, folded cloths. Nothing thrown together, nothing random, everything placed with intention. Margaret took a step forward. Her shoes echoed softly against the wood. The sound carried, too clean for something forgotten. Rex moved ahead of her this time, not rushing, not searching, walking, like he was moving through a place he recognized. He passed by the shelves, paused briefly at a corner, then continued down the narrow hall. Margaret followed, her heart beginning to beat harder again. Not from fear, from something deeper, something pulling at memory. The hallway opened into a larger space, a small living area. A table stood near the center, its surface worn smooth by use. A single chair tucked beneath it. To the side, a narrow bed, neatly made, the blanket folded with care. Margaret's breath caught. She stepped closer. Her hand reached out, hovering just above the table. The wood grain, the small nick near the edge. She knew it. She had seen it before. Not here, but somewhere. A long time ago. "No," she whispered. Her voice trembled slightly. Rex stopped near the bed, turning to look at her. Not alert, not tense, just watching. Margaret moved slowly through the room. Every detail sharpened as she looked closer. A lantern placed on a hook by the wall. A small cabinet with carefully stacked dishes. A coat hanging on a peg, old, worn, but clean. Nothing abandoned, nothing forgotten. It felt maintained, even after all this time. She stepped into the adjoining space, a narrow kitchen area, a small stove, compact but functional. Shelves stocked with jars, empty now but labeled. Water containers lined neatly beneath the counter. Everything practical, everything deliberate. This wasn't a hiding place. It was a living place. Margaret turned slowly, taking it all in. The walls, the floor, the quiet. And then it hit her. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way the shelves were arranged, the way the tools were sorted, the precision, the patience. Daniel. Her chest tightened. She started, then stopped. The thought felt too large to say out loud, too heavy to hold all at once. She walked back into the main room, her steps slower now, more careful, as if the space itself demanded it. Rex had settled near the table, lying down. Calm, certain, like his job was done. Margaret lowered herself into the chair across from him. The wood creaked softly under her weight. Her hands rested on the table, that familiar table, and suddenly she wasn't in the underground room anymore. She was in the old garage. Years ago. Daniel standing over a workbench, sanding down a surface just like this one. She had asked him what he was making. He had smiled, said it was nothing important, just something he wanted to get right. Margaret's eyes filled, but no tears fell yet. She looked around again, at everything, at the care in every detail, at the silence that didn't feel empty. "He didn't tell me," she whispered. Rex's ears twitched slightly at the sound of her voice. Margaret let out a slow breath. Not shaky, not broken, just steady. And in that steadiness, something shifted. This wasn't something thrown together in secret for no reason. This wasn't fear. It wasn't desperation. It was preparation, thoughtful, patient, built piece by piece, over time, for a reason she hadn't understood. Until now. Margaret leaned back slightly in the chair, her eyes tracing the lines of the ceiling. She could almost see him here. Working, measuring, adjusting, quiet as always, never saying more than he needed to. She had thought she knew all his routines, all his habits. But this had been something else entirely, something he had kept separate, hidden, not out of distance but out of intention. Rex stood slowly and walked toward the hallway again. He stopped at the entrance, glancing back at her. Margaret followed his gaze. There was more. Of course there was. She pushed herself up from the chair. Her movements slower now. Heavier with understanding, but steadier than before. She walked toward the hallway, toward whatever came next. Because this place, this house no one had seen, wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of understanding what had been built here. And why. Margaret stood at the mouth of the narrow hallway, the flashlight steady in her hand. The beam cut through the dim space, revealing a second door at the far end. Closed. Simple. Wood. Like everything else down here. Rex waited beside her, not pushing ahead this time. He watched her, as if this part wasn't his to lead. Margaret walked forward. Each step echoed softly, the sound absorbed quickly by the walls. The air felt different here, quieter, more contained. She reached the door and rested her hand against it. The wood was smooth, worn just enough to show it had been opened before. More than once. She turned the handle. It gave easily. Inside, the room was smaller. No bed, no table, just shelves, and a single metal box placed carefully at the center. Margaret stepped inside slowly. The beam of her flashlight moved across the shelves first. More tools. Not for building, for keeping. Bundles of rope, spare batteries, sealed containers labeled in Daniel's handwriting, dates, contents, notes written in his precise, careful print. He had organized everything, prepared everything, like he had known this place would need to last. Margaret lowered the flashlight slightly. Her eyes settled on the metal box. It wasn't large, but it was placed too deliberately to ignore. Rex stayed near the doorway. He didn't come closer. He didn't need to. Margaret crossed the room and knelt in front of the box. Her fingers hovered over the lid. For a moment, she hesitated. Not from fear, from something deeper. A quiet certainty that whatever was inside would change something. She opened it. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, there were no tools, no supplies, just a stack of envelopes. Neatly arranged, bound together with a thin piece of twine. Margaret stared at them. Her breath slowed. Her hands, steady now, reached in and lifted the bundle out. The top envelope was addressed in Daniel's handwriting. Not to anyone else, to her. Margaret. No last name, just her. She swallowed, then carefully untied the twine. The envelopes shifted slightly in her hands. Some thinner, some thicker, all sealed, all waiting. She opened the first one. The paper inside was folded twice, worn slightly at the edges. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable, steady, measured, the way he had always written. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means you found the place. I wasn't sure if you ever would. Not because you couldn't, but because I didn't know when you'd need to. Margaret's chest tightened. She lowered herself onto the floor without realizing it. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. He hadn't written this in a hurry. There were no crossed-out words, no hesitation in the lines, just calm, intent. I started building this a long time ago. Not all at once, just weekends at first, small things. Things I told you were repairs, or jobs I picked up. I didn't lie because I wanted to keep something from you. I just didn't know how to explain what I was trying to do. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. She could see it. All the times he had come home late, hands rough, clothes carrying the scent of dirt and wood. She had asked, He had answered simply, "Work. Always work." I needed a place that couldn't be taken. Not by banks, not by people, not by anything that could change without warning. Something steady, something that would stay, even if everything else didn't. Her fingers tightened slightly on the page. The room around her felt closer now, more real, more personal. I didn't know what would happen after I was gone, but I knew enough to see things shifting. People get different, Margaret. When there's something to divide, something to claim. I hoped I was wrong. I wanted to be wrong. Margaret's breath caught, a quiet, sharp sound in the still room. But if I wasn't, then I wanted you to have somewhere no one else could touch. Somewhere that didn't depend on anyone's decisions but your own. A place you could go without asking, without explaining, without being told what it was worth. Her vision blurred slightly. She blinked, but the words stayed clear enough. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to carry the weight of it before you needed to. You've always carried enough, more than you ever said out loud. This wasn't meant to be another thing for you to worry about. It was meant to be something you could find when the time came. If the time came. Margaret lowered the letter slightly. Her hand pressed against her chest. She could hear him. Not his voice, but the way he had always thought. Quiet. Careful. Seeing things ahead of time without making a noise about it. She looked down again. If things stayed good, then this place would never matter. And I would have been happy with that. More than happy. But if they didn't, then I needed you to have something that was yours, truly yours. Not given, not borrowed, not taken back. Yours. Margaret's shoulders trembled once, just once, then stilled. She sat there in the quiet, the letter resting in her hands. Rex shifted slightly at the doorway. A soft movement. Nothing more. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Not rushed, not embarrassed, just present. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back on top of the stack. There were more. Many more. Each one waiting. Each one holding pieces of something she had never fully seen. She looked around the room again. At the shelves, at the tools, at the careful order of everything. This wasn't something built in fear. It wasn't panic. It wasn't escape. It was thought. Time. Patience. Daniel hadn't been hiding. He had been preparing. Not for himself. For her. Margaret let out a long, slow breath. The kind that settles deep. The kind that doesn't shake. I didn't see it, she said quietly. Not with regret. Not with blame. Just truth. Rex stepped forward now, closing the distance. He sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the steady warmth of him against her arm. Margaret rested her hand on his head. He leaned into it, just slightly, the way he always had. The room didn't feel hidden anymore. It didn't feel secret. It felt known. Finally. Margaret looked at the stack of letters again. There would be time to read them. All of them. But not all at once, not today. Today was enough. She placed the bundle back into the metal box, leaving the top envelope resting just slightly higher than the rest. Then she closed the lid. Carefully. Deliberately. She stood slowly. Her knees stiff but steady. Rex stood with her. Together, they stepped back into the hallway. Back into the larger space. back into the house that had been built in silence, and now was finally being understood. Margaret stood in the center of the underground room, her eyes moving slowly across everything again. But this time, it was different. Before, she had been seeing it. Now, she was recognizing it. The way the shelves were spaced for easy reach, the way the lantern hung at a height that didn't require stretching, the careful placement of tools, not just organized, but arranged for use by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Daniel hadn't built this for a stranger. He had built it for her. Margaret let that settle. Not all at once, just enough to breathe through. Rex moved past her, circling once before settling near the base of the stairs. His body relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in days, not tense, not alert. At ease, like this place answered something in him. Margaret walked toward the small kitchen area. She ran her fingers lightly along the counter. Dust clung faintly to the surface, but not thickly. It hadn't been touched in years, but it hadn't been left to decay either. The air down here had preserved things in a quiet, steady way. She opened one of the cabinets. Inside, neatly stacked plates, a small pot, utensils wrapped in cloth. All clean. All ready. Margaret let out a soft breath. "He thought of everything," she murmured. The words didn't echo. They just stayed. She moved through the space slowly, touching things as she went, not to inspect them, to feel them, to confirm they were real. At the bed, she paused. The blanket was folded with that same careful precision she remembered from years ago. Corners tucked, edges aligned. Daniel had always done that, even when no one else would notice. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. It held her weight easily. No creak, no shift, just steady. She looked down at her hands. The small cuts from the blackberry thorns had begun to sting now that the work had stopped, thin red lines across her skin. She flexed her fingers, then looked around again. For the first time, the thought came clearly, not as a question, as a possibility. She could stay here, not just visit, not just pass through. Stay. The idea didn't feel sudden. It felt natural, like it had been waiting for her to catch up to it. Margaret stood and walked back toward the stairs. She climbed slowly, Rex following behind her this time. When she reached the top, the light hit her eyes harder than she expected. She blinked, stepping out into the clearing again. The air felt different now, sharper, more alive. She turned and looked down at the open hatch. It didn't look like much from above, just a dark opening in the ground. Easy to miss, easy to dismiss. Margaret stepped back, studying the surrounding vines. From a distance, the clearing almost disappeared. The blackberry thorns leaned inward again, their tangled branches creating a natural barrier. If she hadn't known where to look, she wouldn't have seen it at all. Rex moved past her, stepping to the edge of the lot. He stood there, looking outward, watching, guarding. Margaret followed him. She stood beside him, her gaze drifting across the land, the overgrown grass, the leaning posts, the quiet stretch of road beyond. It hadn't changed, but she had. She saw it now as something else, not empty, not useless, hidden, waiting. Margaret walked back to the hatch. She hesitated only a second before pulling it closed. The metal settled into place with a low, final sound. The ground returned to what it had been, just another patch of earth. She brushed dirt over the edges. Not to hide it, but to leave it as it was. Undisturbed, Rex watched her, then moved to stand near the entrance again. Satisfied. Margaret wiped her hands against her pants and looked around once more. There was work to do. Simple things. Clearing more space. Making the path easier to walk. Maybe bringing down a few essentials from the trailer. Nothing complicated. Nothing overwhelming. Just steps. She picked up her bag and started back toward the road. Rex stayed close, no longer pulling ahead. They walked in silence. But it wasn't heavy anymore. The trailer came into view, small and temporary. Margaret paused before opening the door. She looked back toward the direction of the lot. She couldn't see it from here, but she knew exactly where it was, and more importantly, what was beneath it. Inside the trailer, everything felt smaller, tighter, less certain. She set her bag down and stood in the center of the room. Listening. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint rattle of the window, it all felt temporary. Margaret moved to the small counter and filled a glass with water. She drank slowly, then set it down. Her eyes drifted to the chair near the door. Her coat still hung there, her suitcase still half unpacked. For a moment, she just stood there. Between two places. One she had been given, one that had been built. She reached for the coat, put it on, then turned to Rex. "We're not staying here tonight," she said quietly. He stood immediately. No hesitation. Margaret allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not wide, not forced, just there. She gathered what she needed. A few blankets, a flashlight, some food. Nothing more. When she stepped outside again, the air felt different. Not because it had changed, but because she knew where she was going. Rex walked beside her. Steady, certain. They didn't rush. There was no need. The path was already there, even if no one else could see it. And as they moved toward the lot again, the silence between them settled into something new. Not empty, not uncertain, but quiet. In the way a place feels when it's finally being lived in. The first night passed without trouble. Margaret slept deeper than she expected. Not long, but steady. No sudden waking, no listening for footsteps, no waiting for something to be taken from her. Just rest. Rex stayed near the base of the stairs, his body stretched along the floor, ears lifting at the smallest sounds above. Once or twice he shifted, listening to something far off, the wind maybe or a passing car, but he never barked. He didn't need to. This place felt contained, protected, by design, by intention. Margaret woke before the light above had fully settled into morning. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and listened. Silence. Not empty. Just quiet. The kind that lets you hear your own breath without it feeling loud. She stood, stretched her stiff back, and moved toward the small kitchen area. The routine came naturally. Boiling water, setting things in place, using what was there. It didn't feel like she was borrowing the space. It felt like she was stepping into something already prepared for her. Rex rose when she moved, padding softly across the floor. He didn't pace anymore, didn't circle. He simply stayed close, watching, present. Margaret finished her coffee and climbed the stairs. When she opened the hatch, morning light spilled down, soft and gray through a thin cloud cover. She stepped out onto the surface. The lot looked the same as it had before, untouched, unremarkable. But she knew better now. She closed the hatch carefully behind her, brushed the dirt into place, left no sign. Rex moved ahead, scanning the edge of the property. Still, alert, Margaret stood for a moment, breathing in the cool air. There was something grounding about standing here now, something steady. She turned toward the road and stopped. A car, parked just off the cracked shoulder, new, clean, out of place. Margaret didn't move right away. Her eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the details. Dark sedan, engine off, driver's side door opening. Her son stepped out. Thomas. He closed the door slowly, glancing around the lot as if measuring it. Calculating. Margaret felt it before he even spoke. The shift. Not the same man who had stood in the doorway on Cedar Street. This version was careful, polished, trying to choose the right tone. Mom. He said it like it was nothing unusual, like showing up here wasn't a decision. Margaret didn't answer right away. Rex stepped forward, placing himself just slightly ahead of her. Not aggressive, but firm. Thomas noticed. His gaze dropped to the dog, then back to her. "He's still with you," he said, almost uncertain. Margaret nodded once. "He is." A pause settled between them. Not long, but enough. Thomas shifted his weight, glancing again at the lot. "I heard some things," he said finally, "about this area." Margaret said nothing. "I mean, property values," he added, clearing his throat. "They're changing. Development moving out this way. People are starting to look at land like this differently." Margaret watched him. Not his words. His eyes. The way they moved. The way they didn't quite settle. Rex didn't move, didn't blink, just stood. Thomas took a step closer. Careful. Measured. "I was thinking maybe we should revisit things," he said. "About the lot. What it's worth. What it could be worth." Margaret tilted her head slightly. Not confused, just listening. "You said it wasn't worth the trouble," she said. Her voice was calm, flat. Thomas shifted again. "Well, at the time, you said it wasn't worth anything." A longer pause. The wind moved faintly through the grass, bending it in slow waves. Thomas exhaled, forcing a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Things change, Mom." Margaret looked past him, toward the road, then back to him. "Yes," she said quietly. "They do." Thomas hesitated. For a moment it seemed like he might say something else, something more direct. But he didn't. Instead, he gestured lightly toward the land. "Have you done anything with it yet?" Margaret let the question hang. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Rex shifted slightly. Not forward, just enough to make his presence clear. Thomas noticed again. This time it wasn't uncertainty in his expression. It was hesitation. Subtle. But there. Margaret took a step forward. Not toward him. Toward the edge of the lot. "Come on," she said. Thomas blinked. "Where?" "Just to the line." She walked slowly, Rex beside her. Thomas followed after a second. Reluctantly, they stopped near the edge where the grass met the cracked road. Margaret turned, looking back across the land. The overgrowth, the vines, the quiet. From here it looked exactly like he had described it before. Nothing. Unusable. Forgettable. She let him see it that way. For a moment. Then she looked at him. "This is as far as you need to go," she said. Her voice hadn't changed, still calm, still even. But something in it, something steady, made Thomas stop. He glanced past her, toward the deeper part of the lot, as if expecting her to invite him further. She didn't. Rex stood between them. Still, unmoving, not blocking aggressively, just present. Drawing a line that didn't need to be explained. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since he arrived, he didn't have anything ready to say. Margaret watched him. Not with anger, not with resentment, just clarity. He shifted again, looking back toward the car. "I just thought we should talk," he said, quieter now. "We are," she replied. Another pause, the kind that settles things without needing more words. Thomas nodded once, slow, uncertain. Then he turned, walked back toward the car. He didn't look back until he reached the door. And when he did, it wasn't at the land. It was at her. Margaret stood where she was, Rex beside her. Neither of them moved. Thomas hesitated for a second longer, then got in. The engine started. The car pulled away. The sound faded quickly, leaving the road empty again. Margaret remained at the edge of the lot, watching until there was nothing left to see. Then she turned, looked back across the land, the same overgrowth. But now, there was a boundary, not marked by fences, not written down anywhere, just understood. Rex walked ahead a few steps, then stopped, glancing back at her. Waiting. Margaret followed. Not rushed, not uncertain, just steady. As they moved deeper into the lot, the vines closed in behind them once more. And the world above, with its voices, its claims, its shifting values, faded again into something distant, something that no longer reached where she stood. Margaret walked through the vines without hesitation now. The path wasn't visible to anyone else, but it was there, pressed into the earth just enough to remember her steps. Rex moved ahead, parting the branches with his shoulders, then slowing so she could follow. He no longer searched. He guided. They reached the clearing. The hatch sat where she had left it. Unremarkable. Hidden in plain sight. Margaret knelt, brushing away the thin layer of dirt and leaves she had settled over the edges earlier. Her hands moved with quiet familiarity. No rush, no doubt. She opened it. The cool air rose to meet her again. Steady, unchanged. She descended without pausing this time, each step firm beneath her weight, each movement sure. Rex followed close behind. Inside, the space greeted her the same way it had before. Calm, ordered, waiting. But now, it wasn't waiting anymore. Margaret set down the small bundle she had carried from the trailer. A folded blanket. A few cans. A lantern she had found in the back of the cupboard. She moved through the room, placing things where they made sense. Not rearranging, not replacing, just adding. Carefully, respectfully. as if she were continuing something, not starting over. Rex circled once, then settled near the base of the stairs again. Watching. Always watching. Margaret lit the lantern and hung it where the old one had been. The light spread softly across the walls, warming the wood, filling the space without overwhelming it. She stood in the center of the room and looked around. At the table, at the bed, at the shelves, at the quiet, steady work that had been done long before she understood why. She walked to the table and rested her hands on its surface. The same familiar grain beneath her palms, the same small mark near the edge. She smiled, just a little. Not because anything had been returned to her, but because something had been here all along. She moved to the small cabinet and opened it. Took out a plate, set it on the table. Simple, ordinary. But it felt like something important, like a beginning. Above her, the faint sound of wind passed over the land. Muted, distant. Nothing like the sharp, exposed gusts she had felt standing out in the open before. Down here, it was softened, filtered. Margaret sat in the chair and let the quiet settle around her. Not heavy, not empty, just present. Rex shifted slightly, his eyes moving toward the ceiling for a moment before relaxing again. Everything here held. Nothing pressed in, nothing demanded. Time moved differently in this space. Not slower, just steadier. Margaret leaned back slightly in the chair, her gaze drifting upward. She could almost trace the path Daniel had taken building this place, step by step, board by board, not for recognition, not for praise, just because he believed it would matter one day. She thought about the house on Cedar Street, the door closing, the voices inside already moving on without her. She thought about the lawyer's office, the way her son had spoken about the land. Dismissive. Certain. She thought about the lot itself, the way it had looked, overgrown, forgotten. And then she looked around again, at what had been beneath it. Protected. Hidden. Waiting. Margaret stood and walked slowly toward the hallway. She paused at the doorway of the smaller room. The metal box remained where she had left it, closed, patient. She didn't open it this time. There would be time for that, all the time she needed. Instead, she turned back, returned to the main room, to the table, to the chair, to the space that had quietly become hers. She picked up the lantern and adjusted its position slightly. The light shifted, softened, settled. Rex stood and moved closer, resting beside her chair. His body relaxed, his breathing slow, content. Margaret reached down, her hand resting gently on his head. He leaned into it. Just enough. They stayed like that for a while. No words. No need for them. Above, the world would keep moving. Values would rise. People would return with new reasons, new calculations. But down here, none of that reached her. Margaret looked around one last time, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, fully, clearly. She had not been left with nothing. She had been left with something no one else had seen, something built quietly, patiently, with care that asked for nothing in return. And now, she was here, not as someone who had lost everything, but as someone who had finally found what had been meant for her all along. The kind of place that didn't need to prove its worth, because it was already enough. Margaret sat there a while longer, her hand resting on Rex's head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The lantern light softened the edges of everything, like the room itself was exhaling. She thought about how close she had come to never knowing.
If Fred hadn't stopped that first day, if he hadn't refused to leave it alone, if he hadn't stood there, quiet, certain, when she still believed there was nothing here, she would walk away, shorn it, let it go, just like they expected her to. Her fingers moved gently through Red's fur. You knew, she whispered. He didn't move. He didn't need to. For the first time, she understood something she hadn't seen in all those years with Daniel. He hadn't built this because he was afraid. He built it because he just took time. Just think that one day she would need something no one else could take from her. And somehow, the only one who recognized that place wasn't a person. It was the one who never questioned it. Margaret looked around the room again, not with surprise this time, just recognition, like something that had always been hers, that finally found its way back. And she wondered quietly how many things in our lives look like nothing until the one who she clearly refused to walk away.